Welcome to this UK Energy Research Centre webinar on public attitudes towards low carbon heating technologies in Britain. So my name's Jess Britton. I'm a research fellow at Edinburgh University and part of the UKERC consortium. I'll be chairing the session today. And as I say, today's webinar is based on some very timely research on public views of the future of low carbon heating. It was carried out under the infrastructure theme of UKERC Phase 4. And the research was carried out by Professor Nick Pidgeon and Dr. Will Smith at Cardiff, Dr. Christina Dembski at the University of Bath, and Dr. Sarah Becker, formerly of Cardiff University. And as many of you might have seen, there was a report associated with the research that was launched this week, and I believe we'll be putting a link to that report in the chat for anyone who hasn't seen it. In terms of the format of this session today, we'll be starting with a presentation from Nick and Will talking about the findings of their research, and then we'll be following that up with a response from two panellists. So that's Dr. Alexa Spence, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Nottingham, and Tom Ford, part of the team on strategic heat decisions in DESNZ, and we'll then open it up to a wider Q&A with participants. So as we go along, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. I would ask that those go in the Q&A, not in the comments section, to make sure we don't miss any. And I think everyone's kind of automatically muted, but we will be checking those questions as we go along, and I've left plenty of time to discuss that at the end. We will be recording the webinar. That recording's already started, and we'll be sharing the recording with everyone who's signed up. So welcome again, and I will pass over to Nick and to Will for their presentation on the research.
So good afternoon, everybody, and Panel and in Welsh, as we say from Cardiff. It's somehow appropriate to be discussing domestic heating after, in fact, the coldest night of this winter in the UK so far. I'm one of the co-investigators for the UK Energy Research Centre in the current phase. The project team is shown here, and they've been a core part of UKERC during its current fourth phase. As Jess has mentioned, we'll be presenting findings of a major empirical study on the occasion of the launch of its results and publication of a UKERC briefing document on the findings, and that's now available online. So why this topic now? In the UK, as in several other European countries and parts of the US and elsewhere as well, domestic heating contributes a major segment of territorial carbon emissions. Currently, approximately, I think it's almost 80% of in-home heating in the UK uses natural gas. So change is urgently needed in order to meet our net zero targets. Within UKERC, which is an interdisciplinary consortium involving both engineering, policy and social science, it's recognised the public's beliefs, choices, practices around heating will be critical to the success of that transition. Understanding those beliefs is the objective of the current research. So the policy context, very briefly, many people will know this. UK policy currently emphasises the role of consumer choice combined with subsidies to households, so for heat pumps installation, for example. However, what literature there is emphasises low public awareness of low carbon heating, or the work that's been done in the past, but paired with satisfaction that for those who have changed for current gas heating systems. So what did we do in the current survey? I should say there's not a lot of published information in the scientific literature on this topic. So we were looking at an area where research needed to be done. On the approach, the sample was nationally representative for Great Britain, collected online in February, March of 2023. Now, as context, it was quite important we did it then, because this followed the very large rise in domestic energy bills during the last winter. And we're particularly interested, although we won't report that today, on the issue of fuel vulnerability and fuel poverty and the impact upon beliefs about low carbon heating, but that's for another analysis and another day. We focused on three key potential heating technologies for the UK and other countries: heat pumps, hydrogen, and district heating. The survey had three main elements. We explored support and opposition and various measures of willingness to adopt all three technologies. But given anticipated low awareness from our reading of the previous literature, we also provided information to respondents on the three technologies, plus had a decision pathway element exploring factors which might further impact willingness to adopt. The survey design, finally, also measured a range of contextual variables shown here, which we know might impact beliefs and willingness to adopt low carbon heating. So this is quite a large data set we've got here, for which we can only scratch the surface in the presentation today. So here's an example of some of the information provided to survey respondents, in this case for hydrogen. So this covered, and they were asked to read through and digest it. It covered insulation, disruption, costs, use, readiness, and the environment. A similar format was used for all heat pumps and district heating, and all survey respondents saw all information cards. For the informed choice element, we see here, first, after the information provision, a number of beliefs were assessed. For the decision pathway element, which then followed that, we then asked respondents to reflect further on their willingness to adopt, given possible policy scenarios. So, for example, what if it turned out that the option were cheaper to run or more disruptive than expected? We were interested in the impact on and change in beliefs as a result of that extra information provision. So I'll now unshare and hand over to Will for a detailed discussion of some of the results. Thank you.
So I'm not going to spend too long today talking about our demographic results in detail. Just wanted to note the final sample size we collected was just over 2,200 respondents. And also, I think to give kind of a useful context to our results, I think it's useful to pay attention to the financial demographics. So what we found was the majority of our respondents reported reducing their spending as a result of higher energy bills, and also reported themselves as being likely to reduce their heating. Furthermore, a third of our respondents reported themselves as being to some extent energy vulnerable, which is consistent with national estimates. So moving on to our results. So first off, awareness and knowledge regarding low carbon heating. So we found the majority of our respondents knew at least something about low carbon heating technologies, including the need to transition to low carbon heating in general. We can see there are some differences between technologies. So for example, if you look at heat pumps, third from the right here, we can see the level of awareness and knowledge is higher than for district heating to the right of that. But nevertheless, in both cases, the majority knew at least something. So this is encouraging. So this shows there is clearly knowledge is clearly present. However, the caveat is when we look at the population who did know something about decarbonized heating, we can see the majority knew hardly anything or a little. So while support was present, there's a sense that, while awareness was present, there's a sense that in-depth knowledge was limited. This is reflected as well in our findings relating to the perceived relative importance of decarbonizing heating as a behavior relative to other carbon-reducing behaviors. So we can see for using low-carbon heating at home, this is perceived as being a relatively important behavior, but not as important as behaviors like using public transport or generally reducing domestic energy use. Similarly, if we look at the relative contribution of heating and cooling of buildings to UK carbon emissions, it is seen as an important source of carbon emissions, but less so than transport, consumer goods, and primary materials industry, when in reality, this is more equivalent. And you can see that illustrated here by this bar highlighted with the pink arrow, denoting the amount of our respondents who thought each industry contributed a lot to UK carbon emissions. You can see for heating and cooling buildings, this is much lower than, for example, primary material industry. So there's a sense that the majority of our respondents know at least something about decarbonized heating technologies, but in-depth knowledge is limited. And decarbonizing heating is seen as less important versus other behaviors, such as using public transport. So moving on to our results regarding support for decarbonizing heating. So as Nick mentioned, we assess support after providing our participants with information via those information cards Nick ran through earlier. So these are measures of informed support. What we found is that overall, a higher proportion of our respondents supported rather than opposed each technology. Again, there are some differences. So if you look at, for example, the margin between opposition and support for heat pumps on the left here, we can see about a margin of about 40%. Which is not quite as great for district heating to the right, but nevertheless, in both cases, a high proportion supported rather than opposed. And again, this is a really encouraging result. This highlights there really is a clear base of support. However, the caveat is, whilst we can look at this in terms of support versus opposition, we could also frame this as support versus ambivalence, which is marked here as this blue bar in the middle. We can see that for each of our technologies, there was quite a large amount of respondents that were basically undecided in whether they supported or opposed each technology. So again, there's a sense that support is very much present, but there are limitations. And this is really clearly indicated in some of the variables we collected adjacent to support. So we collected data on affective impression, which is kind of an instinctive emotional response to information, perceived benefits versus risks, and also willingness to adopt each technology given a hypothetical opportunity to do so. And in each case, we see this slight attitude of ambivalence. So respondents were somewhat more positive towards each technology, perceived somewhat more benefits than risks, and were somewhat willing to adopt each technology. Holding on to that idea of willingness to adopt each technology, giving an opportunity, in our informed choice section, what we wanted to do is really dig into that idea a little bit more and kind of explore it and challenging it. Like Nick said, by seeing how an individual's initial position of being willing or unwilling would change given a series of positive and negative scenarios. And so I think what we were really looking for here, why we did this, was to try and see the presence of these key enabling factors. So for example, if an individual is willing to install a heat pump, is this willingness a product of many small considerations, or does it come down to one or two factors, for example, cost? Well, what we found was instead of finding any distinct factors shaping willingness one way or another, we found this kind of unexpected effect of belief bias, which we can see here as this clear pattern of dissociation, wherein an individual's initial position of willingness or unwillingness determined what they saw as important or unimportant in a fairly uniform way. So what do I mean by that? So let's look at our data on heat pumps here. So what we found for these first four initial positive scenarios I've highlighted here regarding heat pumps, we can see for those initially willing to adopt a heat pump, who are marked here as in blue as this blue bar, we can see this deflection to the right, indicating increased willingness to adopt. Whereas for those who are initially unwilling to adopt heat pumps, marked here in red, we can see this is much less present. And vice versa, if we look at these last four negative scenarios, we can see for those who are initially unwilling to adopt heat pumps, we can see quite a strong negative deflection to the right, indicating they were less willing. Whereas for those who are initially willing, this effect isn't present, or it's even reversed in one case. And we found this as well for all of our technology types. So I'm just showing the three figures here to show that these results were basically uniform across each technology. And we consider this kind of unexpected because we know from our own data that knowledge of decarbonized heating technologies is quite low. So we would assume that our respondents were on the whole probably forming their attitudes based on the limited information we had provided them in the informed choice element, which wasn't a great deal of information. So we would expect these attitudes to be sort of weak and amenable to change, but really we found the opposite. So the question we had is, what factors aren't we capturing here that are apparently responsible for forming these relatively stubborn attitudes? This is a question we're really still kind of answering. We'll definitely be tackling it more in some of our upcoming academic publications, but we do publish some exploratory analyses trying to answer this in the briefing. Now, I haven't really got time today to cover all of the results from that analysis, so do please refer to the briefing for that. But I just wanted to highlight some of our key findings here. So what we found was that energy security concerns, specifically dependence on fossil fuels, fear of power cuts, and concerns over dependence on foreign energy import, as well as pro-environmental values, specifically preventing pollution and protecting natural resources, we found these were more influential than other variables in shaping willingness to adopt each technology type. And this is interesting because, these are relatively pragmatic, I think, social and environmental concerns. We also want to highlight, just because it's become quite important in our follow-up analyses, is this social circle effect. This is where knowing one or more individual in your social circle, so for example, a colleague, a family member, a peer, knowing one or more individuals in your social circle using a low carbon heating technology increases willingness to adopt all low carbon heating technologies. This is a really interesting finding. Just to talk a little bit more about it. So this is quite a complex slide, and this is not data we're publishing in the briefing, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But just to say, one of the things we'll explore in our upcoming publication will be how the social circle effect turns out to be really central in leveraging influence across almost all of the variables in our data set, including willingness to adopt decarbonised heating technologies. And, I take this as being a really encouraging finding, because it kind of suggests we might expect it to be sort of a snowball effect, wherein as uptake of low carbon heating technologies grows, maybe, that'll work as kind of a passive force, facilitating and snowballing uptake across society at large. So, yeah, please look forward to that. Just to talk lastly about our results relating to responsibility, trust, and fairness. I'm going to begin now. This data here is actually more tangential to our main findings on trust, but I think helps provide a really useful context for understanding our findings. So what we did was we measured opposition and support for 3 policies for facilitating the transition to decarbonising heating in the UK. And what we found was really strong support for these 2 policies on the right here. You can see it's single-digit opposition versus double-digit support. For the policies involving the introduction of low-carbon heating for all new build homes and the introduction of subsidies for heat pumps. In contrast, we found much more mixed and marginal support for this policy involving a ban on the sale of gas and oil boilers. And so what we think this represents really is that respondents were positive towards policies that represent a significant financial investment from the government and other actors, whereas they're much less positive towards policies that legislate the transition to decarbonised heating through forcing a change in consumer activity. So it's kind of a clear dissociation there, I think. And that's really reflected in our broader findings relating to trust. So we found that government energy companies were more frequently viewed as bearing most of the responsibility to pay for the transition. Again, that's entirely consistent with our findings on that previous slide. We found on the whole low trust for government and energy suppliers. This is consistent with previous research. And this was both to make decisions and provide information, with more trust in experts and peers, and again, people in that kind of social circle. We also found that whilst respondents thought they should be involved in making decisions about the energy transition to decarbonised heating specifically, they felt they wouldn't be in practice and didn't expect the transition to be really fair or transparent. Presenting, this is a clear barrier and challenge. So, to sort of summarize this, we can see there are these issues with establishing trust, and the public clearly emphasize the role of the government and other actors to pay for the transition. So as we can see in that previous slide showing the different policy options, this clearly sets the conditions for public support of policies that emphasize financial support, and the opposition for policies that don't and more emphasize public responsibility. But also in the briefing, we kind of refer to this as setting the potential for a governance trap. So I think these results are a little less encouraging. There's a bit more to be wary of here. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of conclude and wrap up some of the results I've spoken about, and also mention some recommendations at the same time. And again, please do refer to the briefing for these recommendations in more detail. I'm just going to kind of touch on them quite lightly here. But what we found was that awareness was present, but in-depth knowledge was limited. So this shows quite straightforwardly there's clearly a need for all actors involved in the decarbonised heating transition to work to raise both the level of knowledge of decarbonised heating technologies generally and also their benefits. Despite that, we found, really encouragingly, when informed, the public showed clear support for all decarbonised heating technologies. And whilst there is a proportion of the public who seem still undecided, nevertheless, there's a sense that, there's this clear foundation of support, and the public seem both ready for and supportive of the transition. Interestingly, we found, again, these sort of key factors of energy security concerns, pro-environmental attitudes, and this social circle effect was very influential in increasing willingness to adopt low-carbon heating technologies. And so I think, this probably presents some important food for thought for both government and energy sector messaging and strategy. We can see the public feeling strained financially and clearly support policies that emphasize financial commitments from both the government and other actors. And so it seems likely that for the transition to succeed, it'll probably need to feature some stronger financial support. We found, again, consistent with prior research, there are clearly some issues with trust in government and energy sector actors. So, again, straightforwardly, there's a need to sort of develop more of a foundation of trust. And importantly, we found there are actors and stakeholders who are clearly already seen as trusted. So there's a sense in which, all actors need to sort of work together to sort of grow trust and also leverage existing sources of trust. Finally, we found the public expects clear involvement from the government. The public view the government, energy sector actors and other actors as basically responsible for taking the lead on this. And so whilst this is kind of a challenge to government, I think this is also a great opportunity for the government to take a stronger and more top-down strategy. Okay, great. So that was kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our results. If anything wasn't clear, please ask us in the Q&A to clarify. Happy to go back. And yeah, of course, refer to the briefing. Okay, thanks. I'll pass back over to our chair.
Thanks, Will. So thanks to both you and Nick for setting out some quite complex findings really clearly and linking it to the policy implications as well. We'll move to our panel, Alexa and Tom, in a moment, but just before we do, to remind everyone to keep posting questions. I can see we've got several in already. I'll also let you know that you can upvote questions that other people might have asked that you are keen that we answer. So please do that as we move through the next session. So I will pass on next, please, to Alexa Spence for her reactions and response. And then after that, we'll move on to Tom. Over to you, Alexa.
Thanks. So I think a welcome addition to the somewhat sparse literature. It's certainly informing my thinking of public attitudes and potential engagement here. So really welcome. Key finding seems to be that attitudes were pretty mixed. I mean, heat pumps are slightly preferred, but that could relate to also the greater familiarity also evidenced in the data. I wonder whether it's reflective generally of the mixed approach of the government and lack of any clear message supporting one technology, leaving it more to the market. And it's interesting that participants did see the government alongside energy companies as being responsible for leading the transition. And we'll just highlighted in the report, it notes the potential for a governance trap, the idea that both the government and the public are kind of waiting the other to act. I also want to link that to the drop in the ocean effect. So this is the idea that people often highlight as a barrier that acting alone won't have an impact, but if everyone acts, it does have a big impact. And there's efficiencies if everybody acts, and a reduction in uncertainty if everyone acts. And we do also see in the data clearly highlighted our uncertainties surrounding the low carbon heating technologies. So I think that government policy can also play a role in reducing this drop in the ocean effect that seems to be there by encouraging and supporting a more significant change or even mandating change so that people perceive a wider change beyond themselves. It's not just them being asked to do it alone. They don't feel like they're acting alone. And I think that points to a need for clear guidance from government. Another big point is that the understanding generally, kind of pattern throughout the board, is that understanding generally of low carbon heat technology remains evidently low, and that's in line with previous research. It indicates that attitudes remain open to be shaped by other forces, and I think more generally highlights the need for more research on awareness of the future of domestic heat options and a need for further clear communications on options available. So the informed choice technique used in this research, I think, is excellent for that reason. So this is the method that Nick mentioned, where participants are provided with short pieces of balanced information about the technologies and asking participants to consider their decisions and attitudes again. That helps to get around the problem of non-attitudes or pseudo-attitudes, where you can just get nonsense responses on topics people don't know much about, which this is obviously one. So I think the data is really nice here in highlighting how changeable attitudes might be. And Will was just showing this in the data that attitudes can change depending on the information that's provided. So when information is provided about cost or terms of installation, people reflected that they could then change their decision. It's also interesting that the point of knowing only one person who's experienced of a technology would have so much influence over the uptake. That really demonstrates the value of experience over simple information provision, which is a whole nother line of research. I won't go off on that just now. But I would caveat the point made in the report that support or opposition is relatively inflexible. They do seem quite difficult to reverse, but quite possible to enhance the initial position. I also doubt they're impossible to reverse. I don't think that was claimed, but especially because we're likely to see big societal shifts here as things start to change more. The upshot is, for me, from the data, that context is really important. And what happens next in terms of trials, market forces and government support is going to determine the uptake. Also means it's going to be quite different between countries. Just a note on that. I'm really interested in the statistical modelling that we'll present a little bit of towards the end there, examining what predicted people's initial attitudes. I'm sure we'll see more in future publications. I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. Some of the findings seem fairly straightforward, kind of intuitive, in line with previous research relating to values and age and gender, for example. The findings relating to the living situation I found particularly interesting, though, and I think have huge potential practical benefit in delivering policy, something like local government perhaps might be particularly interested in. The differences left me thinking about why. So, for example, people who owned their own home were less willing to adopt heat pumps. And I hope that's something we might see unpacked further, perhaps in relation to things like values, age, gender, costs, etc. And one final thing I thought was worth highlighting a bit more is the issue of when people are likely to consider a switch to a low carbon technology. An issue I saw addressed in a recent paper in Nature Energy, actually, which identified timing as one of the most important consideration for changes in home systems in renovation decisions. So people weren't really bothered about replacing a system until it broke. And this study data here found that respondent satisfaction with the current heating system was related to uptake. And I think that's kind of a really interesting issue to investigate further. Seems like we may have to either wait for systems to break or for good incentives to change or mandate change to help facilitate this shift. So I think it's a really useful set of data. It's already informing my thinking, and I'm looking forward to seeing the further analyses from the data.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alexa, for those insights. The panel, the researchers might want to come back on some of those points, but I'll pass to Tom first of all to hear his views as well.
Thank you very much, Jess. Hi, everyone. So I'm Tom. I work at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero on long-term heating decisions. Usually when I reflect on research like this, I try to focus on the positives, perhaps discuss how government policy is already addressing some of the issues identified before finishing with some, I suppose, questions or reflections that may require some kind of further thinking. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the latter. And I think from reading the report and looking at the research, there are kind of three key kind of questions that I can take from this report that I think will warrant kind of further work in future. I think the first kind of question relates to communication with the public. So how do we actually provide information to the public that motivates them to act and then provides them with the knowledge to make informed choices? And I think the research kind of highlighted a couple of points. The awareness is high, but knowledge is low. But also that respondents don't have varying degrees of trust in different institutions and actors. And I think given that alongside the prevalence of misinformation, for example, how do we actually communicate with the public? And I think one question for us to consider really is traditional routes of government communication sufficient? So I'm thinking of policy consultations. People might get a letter or something, or information on .gov.uk. Or do we need to start thinking more innovatively about how we communicate with the public, potentially partnering with trusted institutions in local communities, for example? The second challenge I think that's there is around choice. So what kind of choice actually matters to consumers and how do we best maximize it. So the research highlighted that consumers believe that autonomy in decision making is going to be really important, but I think we actually have to recognize that consumer choices are and will be necessarily constrained when it comes to low carbon heating. So for example, if I have a gas boiler but I quite fancy connecting to a heat network, if there isn't one in my area, I can't really do that. Similarly, if hydrogen was going to play a role in heating in future, and let's say it's in a different area from the area in which I live, I can't really just opt for that technology. So in given that those constraints, as I said, I think the policy challenge is understanding what choices matter. And for example, consumers might be happy for their choices to be relatively constrained, provided they have a decent choice of sort of model or brand of heat pump at different price points. I don't know if that's the case, for example, but I think more research there is probably going to be beneficial. And then the kind of final kind of challenge I think that we need to think about more deeply is concerns how the role of different actors in the system is going to change over time, and kind of what are the implications for this. So the research highlighted that consumers believe that government has a leading role to play in the transition. So while that is undoubtedly true, I think the more interesting question actually is, how is government's role in the transition going to change over time, and what are the consequences for consumers and industry and other actors in this space? So if you think about where we are at the moment in the transition to low carbon heating, we're in kind of a very early phase where demand for low carbon heating systems is growing, but from a low base. Knowledge is relatively low. Demand is driven by a small segment in society. And kind of government's role, as we're doing at the moment, is to kind of build markets, support research and development, excuse me, and lay the groundwork basically for a future expansion expansion in future. In this moment, individual choices do not have system-wide consequences. So if Mary down the road buys a heat pump, that doesn't really have any bearing on the operability of the energy system. But that's not going to be necessarily true as we move through the different phases of the transition, where low carbon heating systems become more mainstream and so on. And in this sort of scenario, in later phases of the transition, individual choices, when added together, will have system-wide consequences for how we manage supply and demand, both for those who have low carbon heating systems, but those who in the 2030s, 2040s who are still on gas, but also how we guarantee energy security and how we prioritize and coordinate investment. And again, as we move through those different phases of the transition, other knotty problems will begin to arise. So what happens with the remainder of the gas network? Do we need to decommission it in places? How do we do that? And clearly there's a role for government to play in that space. And depending on how government approaches those issues, that may well have an impact on the levels of consumer choice available to people. So I think there's some work needed to consider how the role of different actors will change and what the implications of that might be. So I just want to say, finish on that point and just say that I think this is some really valuable research and highlights a number of knotty kind of questions for us to consider in future. And it's through events like this, I think, that we'll hopefully get to the right answer, sharing knowledge and learning from each other. So thank you to the researchers for a great piece of work.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Tom. And I think some of those themes that yourself and Alexa were pulling out are reflected in some of the questions we've had coming through. So perhaps if I could ask Alexa, Will, Nick and Christina to start their cameras, and we can move into the Q&A. We've had quite a lot of questions in, so we'll get through as many as we can. I've been frantically trying to kind of theme them a little bit. But we will also try and answer any ones that we don't get a chance to, either in the chat, or we can do that with any post-event materials we send out. So if we start with there was two questions around hydrogen in particular. I'm not sure who wants to come in on this, maybe Christina. Partly asking why hydrogen boilers were included, given there's the beginnings of policy shifts away from the use of hydrogen for domestic heating. And also there was a question about whether there's a view of whether campaigns against heat pumps have impacted on the perceptions in the survey.
Yeah, I can answer that, but Nick might also want to come in. It was included in part, so when we made decisions about the survey, I think the policy context might have been slightly different still, or a little bit less clear. So that was part of the reason. We also consulted more widely within UKERC, and I think it was, considered still important enough to include, even if it is just to underscore or provide evidence for the decisions not to go with domestic hydrogen heating. So that's the answer to that one. And around the PR campaigns, I don't think this data can necessarily speak to it. I can just kind of provide my opinion, but I think the combined finding that kind of family and friends are trusted the most for information, and the fact that, if you already know someone, you're more willing to have one as well, suggests that it could have had an effect, but it somehow depends on how that PR campaign might be discussed within your social circle, for example. And if you know someone who has a heat pump who has had a negative experience or positive experience, it's probably more likely to have an effect. But I don't know. I have no idea.
Brilliant, thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on that? Tom, did you want to come in anything in relation to hydrogen for domestic heat?
So I think with hydrogen, so obviously it's quite a controversial topic, but the government's view is that it still potentially has a role to play in heating, particularly for buildings that may not be suitable for technologies like heat pumps, for example. So we've got this commitment to take a decision on the role of hydrogen for heat in 2026, and that's what we're intending to do. So so we'll wait and see in that space. But just on this idea around misinformation around heat pumps and how that affects people's opinions. We think that one of the largest barriers actually to uptake of heat pumps is just simply the cost, both the upfront and the running cost, and that's why a lot of our policies are designed to address those two questions. So I think it might well play a part, but I think from our perspective, there are other reasons why people might be less willing to adopt a heat pump, for example, at this time.
Yeah, sure. I think it'd be good to come back to some of the questions we've had around kind of the role of social networks and other forms of information provision in a little bit, maybe. But I also wanted to ask the questions that were specifically around the information that was provided as part of the survey. So I don't know if Will or Christina wants to come in on this. There was a couple of questions about what information was provided and how. So, for example, there was one asking around what information was provided about the need or not for replacement radiators with a heat pump, and also what information was provided in relation to 2030 boiler bans.
So yeah, I can come in on that. Yeah. So in terms of the boiler bans, very little. So we really just assessed it as an item in that one question, sort of saying, measuring support and opposition towards those three policy options. And yeah, it was essentially as much as we said in the question text was as much information we provided. So we didn't provide too much information to our participants about the broader policy context. We focused more on the sort of technological details, which ties into the question on radiators. So yes, we asked that as a question in our informed choice element. But again, we didn't provide too much information about that. We just sort of said, given the hypothetical possibility you may have to install new radiators, would you be more or less willing? And similarly, I think we addressed it on the information card, but only in passing. Again, like we didn't have much scope to go into great details of information in the cards. And also we didn't really want to. I mean, there's a certain argument for being a bit careful with how much information you provide to participants, as we wanted to measure informed, but not overly influenced support, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if Nick or Christina had anything to add to that, but...
I mean, the only thing I would say, thanks, Will, is the radiator question was interesting because it didn't dent the opinion of people who were willing to adopt heat pumps, which is a significant finding. But if you were kind of not willing to adopt heat pumps initially, based upon the first information, then if you were then told you had to get bigger radiators, you were less so. So it was actually a very clear example of the police bias effect that Will was talking about. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And Nick, did you also want to come in on the question we had from Adam Cooper? It might have been partially responded to as the presentation went through, but they were asking whether the responses were in relation to the kind of symbolic idea of these technologies rather than the actual physical implications of installing and using various decarbonised heating technologies?
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Jess. And there's a long answer and a short answer to this. But what I would say is, yes, you're absolutely correct. But of course, there's lots of evidence that beliefs about such technologies in the hypothetical, i.e. information you pick up from the pub and everywhere else in the world, can have real consequences, particularly with new technologies where prior knowledge is low. So I think that's part of the value of the study. You're trying to kind of understand what people would bring to a decision about this, given a certain package of information which they might pick up. So the other point is, yes, you absolutely, you need to triangulate this with other studies which are looking at use of the technologies in situ, and then you would kind of bring the two together. So heat pumps is a good example. I mean, we won't talk about it today, but we've had a very big project called Living Well in low carbon homes, looking at residents who are living with new heat pumps in new build properties. And I can say, if they're operating functionally and properly, they actually rather like the technologies, many of them. So that will corroborate the initial findings from the survey here. So one tries to bring evidence together. You can't answer everything with a single survey. I think that would be fair to say. Thank you, Jess.
Right, thank you. We've also had a range of questions that are asking about the level of difference we might see across different groups within the survey results. So perhaps you could comment on all of those together. There was one asking about the kind of spatial variation, given that there are slightly different approaches across England, Scotland and Wales to heat decarbonisation policy. So did it vary spatially? And was there variation in terms of age or energy vulnerable groups or any other socio-demographic characteristics?
Yeah, just to talk about that. So for region, we actually did some additional sampling as part of this project. We collected independent samples for Scotland and Wales as well, so we could do a comparison both of our GB dataset, which is the one the briefing is based on, and these datasets as well. We haven't published that data yet, but we did a bit of an exploratory analysis on that. We found surprisingly no real difference between regions. Essentially, the results we report here for the GB dataset are largely representative as well of the results we see in Scotland and Wales as well. Addressing age, I mean, yeah, there was an effective age. We saw a pretty straightforward effect that the older you were, essentially, the less supportive you were of all decarbonised heating technologies. We haven't done too much kind of thorough between groups analysis based on that. That's just some of the results from our exploratory analyses. And the question of, was there a question about support as well? Oh, between technology types. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we did include an item in which we asked each of our respondents to take a definite stance on which technology they preferred the most. That's probably the most direct insight we have. I mean, from that question, we found rather unsurprisingly that the technology most frequently rated as highest preference were heat pumps at around 44% of our respondents, with district heating being the least frequently rated high at 22%. So there were some differences between preferences when we asked that directly. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Right, yeah, thank you. Seeing as you mentioned district heating there, specifically having lower support in the survey, perhaps we could delve into that a little bit more, because there's a few questions about heat networks. One was asking about why that might be, so why approval ratings were lower for heat networks, and one proposing that district heat projects need a level of certainty in demand to develop. You obviously need a baseload of people to connect. So are there any proposals around how we deal with that uncertainty, given that both awareness and approval of district heating schemes is quite low in the survey?
I can offer an answer initially around the first question. I think our survey also provides some evidence that the problem I think the district heating networks have is a little bit that they don't have the most positive rep in this country, and also people are very unfamiliar with them. They don't really know them, but essentially it's this idea of giving up autonomy over your heating the way that most people are used to. And I think that's very different to replacing a gas boiler with something that is still in your home. So I think there's some evidence to show that, you know, that's also what people were worried about being kind of giving up that control. And I think so I think that would be my answer to the first part of the question, but I don't know if Will wanted to come in on that as well, given he's done the analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was evident in some of the sort of qualitative data we collected regarding support. So once they'd expressed their willingness to adopt each technology, we kind of probed that a little bit by sort of asking, well, why were you willing or unwilling? And yeah, for district heating, a pretty common theme was basically, well, in the sense that a lot of people didn't really know what it was. I mean, that's most importantly, but also the sense that maybe it was relinquishing control a little bit, which kind of, I think, amplifies that sense of uncertainty that already existed. Yeah,
great. And Tom or Alexa, did you want to come in at all on the heating? So either from that finding that there was concerns around the kind of control aspect of district heating, but also Tom, for you particularly, obviously there's considerable changes to the regime for district heating coming in from the Energy Act. Do you have any reflections on that?
Just on the future changes. I mean, the person who asked that question has identified, like, hit the nail on the head, I think, with the biggest problem with heat networks, which is how can you, from an investor point of view, guarantee that there's going to be enough people using the network to make it worthwhile. And just in December, we've launched a consultation on heat network zoning in England. So this is the idea that central and local government is going to work with industry and local stakeholders to identify zones across England where heat networks are the lowest cost solution to decarbonising heat, and then that will introduce a level of certainty and help drive investment into them. So if that proposal is enacted, I mean, that's going to happen in the next year or two, I think. So that should be quite a big step to driving investment towards heat networks in England specifically. But yes, that's all I wanted to say on that.
Brilliant, thank you. Alexa, did you want to come in at all, or shall I move on? Or you're muted at the moment.
I mean, just to say briefly that, I think it'll make a big difference where the zones are, and I think we could really see momentum as people have their friends and people they know switching to district heating. So I think we'll see massive shifts. I think we're going to see big changes in people's attitudes as people learn more about it. A lot of people don't have any experience of district heating, don't know much about it, which I think really impacts their attitudes currently.
Brilliant. And kind of drawing on that slightly, there's quite a lot of questions around this really interesting finding about this kind of belief bias. And also questions around, one, how can we improve trust? And two, leading on from that, what sort of organisations might be best placed to provide information? So is that independent advice? Is there a role for local actors to be providing advice? And what's the role of the heating industry and heating engineers specifically? So across the panel, can I maybe ask if you have any reflection on those issues around trust and information? Perhaps starting with you, Christina, if you're happy to take that on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think it through. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet, but I think the immediate answer to that is that we already know this from any other kind of literature around technology acceptance, that just providing information isn't going to change people's attitudes, at least not at this level. But I think around how this interacts with trust is an interesting one, and we might want to do a little bit look at whether there are different, if these different groups trust in different organizations as well. But because there is this kind of, I don't know the rest of that answer. I haven't quite thought it through yet. But I mean, generally, that kind of the kind of deficits in trust that we're seeing isn't just relevant for the transition to heat, and I think it kind of undermines a lot of the kinds of things that need to be done around net zero. So it's not a unique finding to this particular sector. And you could say this, that there's also lack of trust probably in heat, and like heat engineers are not trusting of what the government is telling them about heat pumps, for example. So there is kind of layers of distrust that need to be addressed. But I don't have a articulate short answer to how we deal with that, but I'll see if the panel has something to suggest.
Well, I was going to say something just to follow on from that. I mean, models and theories of trust, of course, break it down into different components. So you have to ask, you know, so one would be expertise. So are you actually expert in the issue? So a heating engineer would be expert, and to some extent government and the energy industry. But then there's another component is, do we think the actor is going to act in our interests? This is where, of course, the energy industry, I hate to say, has fallen over, and it's got a previous project from UKERC showed clearly very high levels of concern and distrust there, because we feel, you know, they're not necessarily always acting in our own interests as individual citizens. So you have to work on the several layers of that. And then the only other thing I would say is, and government don't like me saying this, but sometimes it's useful just to have a bit of distrust anyway. The idea of critical trust, so we can rely on an organization while still saying we don't fully trust it, because, you know, to keep large corporations and large institutions, actors honest, you need to be able to you know, see and scrutinize what they're doing and not take at face value everything that's said. And I think ordinary citizens are not blind to that that reasoning. So you know, I mean, of course it's important to improve trust. But complete blind trust would not be a good thing either for society, I think, in turn, because it is such a complex problem. There are so many interests involved, as the chat is showing. Lots of parties want their voice in there and their narrative in there. So people have to maintain a critical eye. I think the one thing, talking to Tom, seeing Tom there representing government and others who might be on the webinar, I think transparency in information, transparency in relation to where profits go and how finance is working will be two of the main things I think that people want to see in relation to this transition. I'm not sure we necessarily got that completely, but that's something to work for. Thank you.
Yeah. And did you have a perspective on the role of social networks within that trust? Obviously, that was a really interesting finding, I think, in the work. And that could almost be quite kind of a passive policy response, that this thing will gather momentum as time goes by. So have you got reflections on how it could actually be more proactively mobilised in policy?
Well, I think there were a lot. Maybe I can pass that to Alexa as well. I'm sure she's been thinking about this, but in a second. But I think there's a real role for community organisations and local grassroots groups here. And then also, if you can facilitate it through funding or other ways of getting them putting, so in Wales, the registered social landlords are doing a lot of experimentation with new build low carbon homes, which obviously have heat pumps, they have solar panels on the roofs. So you're using actors like that to produce demonstration projects. And although that costs money and a lot of investment from Welsh Government here has gone into those schemes, that's how you start to roll out local community interest in them. But thank you. I'll pass to Alexa.
Oh, I'm on these. Yeah. Yeah, make it real for people. I think super important here. I think somebody already mentioned the role, well, a few people may have mentioned the role of individual engineers here. I've actually seen that kind of the reverse, where discussions and local trials can be really influenced by local engineers. I mean, who do you ask about when you want to change your heating system? I speak to my plumber. I don't immediately look to the government. I speak to a local expert, and I think most people do that. So what I was going to say was that we've seen kind of some negative responses when there's been trusted local heating engineers, etc., saying, I wouldn't do that. I don't trust heat pumps or hydrogen or wherever. And I think tackling that is really important. So as Nick says, trusted local actors. We've had various bits of research. Who do people most trust? And we know that generally trust academics, local NGOs, non-government organizations, community organizations, but also in this case, people with knowledge, people who are engineers. So speaking generally across the literature, consistency across actors and making sure that central government policies are kind of seen and reflected in what's happening locally is really important. So yeah, I mean, I echo Nick's point about making it real and seeing it happen, and demonstration projects, and making sure that any conflicting priorities, that's where we've seen energy companies not been trusted in the past, making sure that any conflicting priorities and the reason for new policies and new initiatives are made clear. You know, we are doing this for this reason. I think that's really important in engaging with the public on this.
Thanks, Alexa. I can see Christina's got her hand up, so I'll move to her quickly before we finish.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think there's the flip side as well, because if you're going to use this kind of social contagion effect, you've got to think a little bit as well how this might play out if it goes beyond the somewhat early adopters or the people who happen to be in trials, and that it's not undermined by negative kind of experiences. So I've advocated for this a couple of times, that, you know, if there's a broader rollout of heat pumps, that they, you know, like a really big push, that there are like 24-hour hotlines that people can call and get stuff fixed really quickly, because what you don't want is the social contagion effect to be negative. You want it to be positive, right? So that is a risk if you go beyond sort of the early adopters, that the negative experiences take over that social contagion effect. So it's really important that those kinds of schemes are, you know, really back up positive experiences.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christina. I think we've probably run out of time to answer any more questions. There's a handful of questions that we haven't had time to answer, and I feel like we could go on a lot longer talking about some of the really complex issues that this research kind of demonstrates. We'll talk afterwards about how we maybe respond to some of those questions, but we'll certainly circulate the recording of this event, slides, and of course the link to the report you should have all received already. So just to make sure we finish close to time, it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to all of the speakers, so to the research team, to the panel, and of course to everyone that's attended for your really interesting questions. I would say please feel free to contact the presenters if there's anything you want to kind of discuss further after this, and everyone please do have a good afternoon. Thanks again and nice to see you all. Cheerio.